The rain had not stopped for 3 days over the kingdom of Vaern, as if the sky itself knew something terrible was about to happen. Alira stood in the center of the throne room, her wrists bound with iron chains that dug into her skin. Around her, the council members whispered behind their hands, their eyes cold and accusing. She searched the crowd for one face, the only face that mattered to her, but he was not there. Cailan Draven, the Alpha King of Vaern, was still 3 days' ride away at the northern border, unaware that the woman he had spent months pretending not to love was about to be sentenced to death. Illyra of the Fen Pack, Councilwoman Vasha said, rising from her seat with a smile that did not reach her eyes. You stand accused of treason against the crown. Letters bearing your seal were discovered in your chambers, detailing troop movements sent to our enemies in Northmoor. How do you answer these charges? I did not write those letters, Illyra said, her voice steady, despite the fear coiling in her chest. I have never betrayed this pack. I would never betray him. A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Vasha's smile widened slightly, so slightly that only Illyra noticed it. The evidence says otherwise, Vasha said. The council has reviewed the letters. The seal is yours. The handwriting matches records from your training years as a scribe. There is no room for doubt. Illyra knew, with a sinking certainty, that the trial had already been decided before she ever entered the room. She was an Omega, born low in the pack hierarchy, raised in the shadow of nobles who had never wanted her near the king in the first place. When Cailan had begun seeking her out, walking with her in the gardens, asking after her days, the whispers had started. Omegas did not become queens. Omegas served, and Vasha, whose daughter had long been groomed to one day sit beside the king, had never forgiven Illyra for catching his eye. The council finds you guilty, Vasha announced, before any real deliberation had taken place. You will be held in the dungeon beneath the keep until dawn, when your sentence will be carried out. 2 guards seized Illyra by the arms. She did not struggle. There was no use in struggling against chains, against a council that had already made up its mind, against a fate that felt as heavy and certain as stone. As they led her from the throne room, she cast one last look at the empty seat where the king should have been sitting, and something inside her chest cracked quietly, like ice breaking beneath still water. The dungeon was colder than she expected. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, echoing against stone walls slick with moss. The guards shoved her into a small cell and locked the iron door behind her, the sound of the bolt sliding into place louder than anything she had ever heard. She sank down onto the cold floor and pulled her knees to her chest, trying to hold herself together. Hours passed. She did not know how many. The only light came from a single torch burning somewhere down the corridor, its glow flickering weakly against the walls. She thought about her mother, long past, who used to tell her that the moon watched over every wolf, guiding them home no matter how far they wandered. She thought about the day she had first met Cailan, when he had found her lost in the eastern woods as a child, and carried her home on his shoulders, even though he was only a few years older himself. She thought about the way he looked at her now, when he believed no one else was watching, like she was something precious he did not yet know how to hold. She had never told him she loved him. She had been too afraid. A king could not love an Omega, everyone said so, and she had believed it enough to keep her feelings locked away, just as she was now locked away in this cell. Footsteps approached, softer than the guard's usual heavy stride. A young man appeared at the bars, his face partly hidden by the shadows. She recognized him as Corwin, one of the dungeon guards who had always been kind to prisoners, offering water or a spare blanket when the others were not looking. I should not be here, Corwin whispered, glancing over his shoulder. But I could not let this happen without asking if there was anything you needed. Illyra looked up at him, and for a moment, she considered simply thanking him and asking for nothing. But then a thought struck her, sharp and urgent. If she could not speak to Cailan before the end, perhaps she could still leave him something. Paper, she said, and something to write with, please. Corwin hesitated only a moment before nodding. He disappeared into the darkness and returned minutes later with a small scrap of parchment, a stub of charcoal, and a candle to see by. He passed them through the bars carefully, his eyes full of a sadness he did not try to hide. I cannot promise it will reach him in time, he said quietly, but I promise I will try." "That is enough," Alira whispered. "Thank you." She waited until his footsteps faded before she began to write. Her hands shook, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything she had never said. The candle flickered as she pressed the charcoal to the parchment, and slowly, the words began to come. "To Kaelin," she wrote, "if you are reading this, then I am already gone, and I am sorry that I could not tell you these things while I still had the chance to see your face when I said them. I am innocent. I never wrote those letters, and I never betrayed you, not for a single moment of my life. I do not know who wanted me gone badly enough to forge my hand, but I hope, for the sake of this kingdom, that the truth finds its way to you eventually, even if I cannot be there to see it. But there is something else I need you to know, something more important than my innocence. I love you. I have loved you since the day you carried me home through the eastern woods, though I did not understand it then. I loved you every time you found reasons to walk beside me in the garden, every time you asked about my day, as though it truly mattered to you. I was afraid to say it, because the world told me an Omega could never be loved by a king, and I believed the world more than I believed my own heart. I do not regret loving you. I only regret staying silent for so long. Please do not let my death make you cold. Please do not let this world's cruelty become your own. Rule with the same kindness you showed a frightened, lost child in the woods so many years ago. That is the king I fell in love with, and that is the king I hope you will always be. Goodbye, Kaelin. Thank you for every moment, even the ones I never told you mattered." Alira folded the parchment carefully, her fingers trembling as she pressed it closed. When Corwin returned near midnight to check on her, she pressed it into his hands. "Please," she said, "if nothing else, make sure he receives this. Whatever happens to me." Corwin's throat moved as he swallowed hard, and he nodded once, tucking the parchment inside his coat. "I swear it," he said, "on my life." Meanwhile, far to the north, Kaelin Draven rode through the storm as though the weather itself could not touch him. A messenger had reached the border camp hours earlier, breathless and soaked from the rain, carrying word that a trial had taken place in the capital, that an Omega named Alira had been accused of treason, and that a sentence had already been passed. Kaelin had not waited to hear more. He was on his horse within minutes, riding through the night with a desperation that startled even his most loyal guards. Something about the accusation did not sit right in his chest. Alira had never once shown interest in politics, let alone treason. She had spent her free hours tending to the pack's youngest pups and helping the healers gather herbs in the hills. The idea that she had secretly conspired with Northmore felt as impossible to him as the moon falling from the sky. But more than logic, it was instinct that drove him forward, the same instinct that had once led him through the eastern woods as a boy, to find a lost, frightened child sitting alone beneath a fallen tree. He had never forgotten her face that day, the way she had looked at him like he was the only steady thing left in her world. He had carried that memory with him for years, quietly, telling no one how deeply it had rooted itself inside him. He rode through the rain without rest, changing horses twice, refusing to stop even as exhaustion clawed at his body. Every mile felt too slow. Every hour felt like it was stealing something from him that he could never get back. By the time the towers of the capital came into view, the storm had begun to break, gray light bleeding through the clouds as dawn approached. Kaelin's heart pounded with a terror he had never known in battle. He urged his horse faster, weaving through the waking streets, ignoring the startled cries of guards who scrambled to open the gates for their king. He reached the courtyard just as the crowd gathered there let out a collective gasp. He was too late. The world seemed to slow as he dismounted, pushing through the stunned onlookers, his chest tight with a grief so sudden and enormous he could barely breathe through it. He reached her just as she fell, catching her before she struck the ground, holding her against him as the rain-soaked courtyard fell utterly silent around them. "Alira," he whispered, his voice breaking in a way none of his subjects had ever heard from their king. I am here now." Her eyes found his, for one last moment, and though she could not speak, something in her gaze told him she had heard him, that she knew, finally, that he had come for her, even though it was too late to save her. Kaelin knelt there in the courtyard for a long time, unwilling to let her go, unwilling to accept that the woman who had quietly become the center of his entire world was gone. It was Corwin who finally approached, kneeling beside him with the folded parchment held out in trembling hands. "She asked me to give you this," Corwin said softly, "no matter what happened." Kaelin took the letter with shaking hands. He read it there in the courtyard, rain and tears blurring the charcoal words together, and when he finished, something inside him shifted permanently. Grief gave way to a colder, sharper resolve. He ordered the dungeon records searched that very hour. Guards combed through ledgers and correspondence, and within a day, the truth unraveled exactly as Kaelin had suspected. Vasha's own steward, frightened and guilt-ridden, confessed that he had been paid to forge the letters and plant them among Illyra's belongings. Witnesses who had testified against her admitted they had been bribed or threatened into their statements. Vasha was stripped of her council seat and exiled from the kingdom before the week was through, her ambitions for her daughter crumbling along with her reputation. But no punishment could undo what had already been lost. Kaelin ordered Illyra's name cleared publicly, her innocence declared before the entire court. He had a small garden planted near the eastern woods where he had first found her as a child, filled with the same wildflowers she used to gather for the pack's healers. It became a place where he visited quietly, away from the eyes of his court, carrying her letter folded inside his coat, close to his heart, for the rest of his days. He never took another queen. Some among his court whispered that the king had grown distant after that spring, quieter, more thoughtful, ruling with a gentleness that surprised even his oldest advisors. But those who knew him best understood that he had simply chosen to become the king Illyra had believed he could be, carrying her memory forward in every decision he made, in every kindness he showed to those who had no voice of their own. And though he had arrived too late to stop her final goodbye, he made certain that her voice, and her truth, would never be silenced again.